When thinking about history, what deserves to be remembered? What should be focused on? When an event happens, who decides what gets to be passed on to the next generation? What details, what facts, what emotions, at what level of analysis, and how do these details get pieced together into a narrative? The reality is that when learning about history or even teaching history, there's really only a certain amount of time that gets set aside for a particular subject or event or theme. You can imagine being in a classroom. Okay, class, we have 45 minutes, time to learn about the Taiping Rebellion before we move on. Of course, that is part of the problem in and of itself, and obviously that abbreviated version of history lends itself to not being able to get a full, complete understanding. But even in that abbreviated version, in that narrative, what gets remembered? What remains? Perhaps we should be asking that same question of the people who lived at the time period. And maybe that's the thing that should be focused on rather than narratives, statistics, events, and facts. For example, you can imagine a knowledgeable history student going back in time and explaining the traditional narratives of the Taiping Civil War to a person in southern China at the time who lived through it. And this knowledgeable history student may be talking about Hong Xiuquan and his visions and the Taiping religion and how that connected to Western imperialism and traditional Qing dynasty government. The student might continue by listing off events and dates and names of battles and commanders and strategic and tactical movements of troops, all of the types of traditional things that a history student might learn about the Taiping Civil War. But again, if they were telling all of this to an average person in a small town that was living through the Taiping Civil War, you have to wonder if any of that stuff would have any relevance to them whatsoever. Most histories and most narratives of history don't focus on things like what would it be like to live through a civil war, not as a politician or a soldier, but as a ordinary, normal person. And of course, you wonder why, because learning about those types of things, in my opinion at least, is interesting in and of itself. But to me, it also reveals something about the human condition. It makes history a little bit more relatable. And in some cases, it may even provide more practical utility than simply learning about traditional narratives and dates and events. Asking questions like, what were the realities of living through a mass trauma type of event? How did ordinary people combat the realities of war psychologically? What types of things gave them comfort or strength? How did people's identities change as a result of war? What did people carry on with them to the future? What did they decide to let go? How was this decided and why? And simply, how did people make sense of just total devastation all around them during the Taiping Civil War? Historian Tobie Meyer-Fong wrote a fantastic book called What Remains, and it tackles questions just like this in the context of the Taiping Civil War. Chief among those questions would be something like, how do people make sense of destruction and violence and chaos all around them on an unthinkable scale? What Tobie Meyer-Fong found in her research, perhaps unsurprisingly, was that many in China at the time of the Taiping Civil War turned to religious or quasi-religious explanations to try to make sense of the world around them. She says, quote, "Many in Jiangnan invoked time-honored religious paradigms to account for carnage heard about, witnessed, or survived, and sought guarantees of safety in the divine logic of reward and retribution. Itinerant preachers, school teachers, and lecturers proclaimed that frugality, orthodoxy in family relationships, respect for staple grains, abstemiousness, vegetarianism, and the practice of honoring the written word by collecting and disposing of scraps of paper all had talismanic powers against death, loss, war, and disease." End quote. Before we fully dig into this quote and this claim, I do think it's important to remember the context here. I did a series on the Taiping Civil War on this podcast just a few episodes ago, and I think it's important to remember the scale of the carnage that was going on in China at this time. You're talking about credible estimates of the death toll being 20 to 30 million people. So if you were an ordinary person living in a area that was touched by this war, you probably saw all of those things: famine, war, disease, violence, unpredictability, and devastation that affected, if not your personal family unit, probably people very close to you. And what you started to have popping up were moral activists. Oftentimes, these were educated local elites who were trying to do the right thing as far as rebuilding towns and villages that were ravaged by war. They may have been trying to do this literally by collecting funds for militias or eliciting donations to help refugees, but they may also have been trying to heal things psychologically in an effort to bring security and sanity to a, again, unpredictable and chaotic conflict. Historian Tobie Meyer-Fong introduces one of these moral activists, Yu Ji, saying, quote, "A crusader for cultural renewal and moral transformation before, during, and after the war, in his writings and social practice, Yu Ji tried to clarify the war's meanings for his audience and to accomplish his prior goals of moral transformation in its shadow. An eyewitness to wartime suffering, Yu Ji was a prominent, vocal, and well-connected spokesman for the particular form of religiously inspired moral conservatism that rose to new prominence during the Taiping War." End quote. As Tobie Meyer-Fong points out, characters like this Yu Ji are going around to war-torn areas of China. They are creating written word essays and pamphlets to spread their version of how to make sense of all of this. They're giving lectures and having spoken word events and organizations that can help spread the message. And remember that as the two warring sides and their governments, whether it's the Taiping or the Qing, are preoccupied with killing each other, it may be local elites like this Yu Ji who are stepping in to fill that power vacuum and ultimately helping to shape the narrative and helping to decide what remains after a civil war. So in this particular case, what is Yu Ji's prescription for ordinary people to be saved from this conflict? Tobie Meyer-Fong says, quote, "He offers a list of necessary steps, a recipe for righteous action clearly grounded in his own beliefs and practice. They must shut down the local wine shops and tea houses, stop the performance and publication of wicked dramas, close the brothels, and cease their gluttony. They should donate generously to the Qing military cause, raise militias, and ban lascivious and rebellious plays like The Western Wing and The Water Margin. They must practice vegetarianism, reflect upon their transgressions, and reinvigorate a culture of righteousness, transforming themselves in the process. They must emanate loyalty and filial piety collectively as a community and repay imperial and parental grace in order to express the goodness of their hearts and minds. End quote. Yu is saying here that in order to be saved and in order to survive this war, you need to follow good Confucian principles. Honor your parents, obey the system of relationships that filial piety promotes. Basically, try to be a good person in the philosophical, religious, traditional Confucian paradigm. Now, you may initially think that this seems foolish. How is being a good Confucian going to save you from the roving packs of bandits and the looting armies and the disease and the destruction of cities and towns, all the stuff that we talked about with the Taiping Civil War? So it might seem like a silly message at first until you remember that this message can and did appeal to anyone, regardless of gender, age, station in life, etc. It's a universal message that anybody can subscribe to and anybody can feel like they're accomplishing. You don't need to be special. You don't have to be a fighter or a soldier. It's a way for ordinary people to feel like they can control the uncontrollable. Agency can be a powerful message, and it's actually deeply rooted in human psychology. One psychological concept that seemingly has a lot of weight and validity to it is the concept of the just world phenomenon. The idea is that people tend to instinctively think in terms of rewards and punishments. Furthermore, they tend to think that good people get rewarded for their actions and bad people get punished. So they tend to think that people who are wealthy and successful must have done something good to get there, and they tend to think that people who are victims or are lower on the social status ladder did something bad to get where they are. If you take a Psychology 101 course, sort of a classic exercise is that the professor passes out a scenario that's about a page or two long, and it's talking about the victim of a robbery or an assault or some other misfortune. And it goes into all the details of the victim's life. So maybe they were out super late at 2 or 3 in the morning, and that's when they got robbed. Maybe they were negligent of the amount of gas in their car, so they had to pull over, and then they got robbed. Maybe they were going out to cheat on their spouse, so on and so forth. And at the end, the professor asks, who is to blame for the attack or the situation? And of course, it's a little bit of a trick because the students will debate the different details of the story and maybe say that it was the victim's fault for going out to cheat on their spouse or for not being proactive enough in filling up their gas. But of course, the main person to blame is simply the attacker. So scenarios like this are used to illustrate this example of the just world phenomenon where people tend to think that bad people get punished and good people get rewarded. People like Yu are tapping into this deep human psychological need for reward and punishment, and they're saying that by speaking and proliferating good words and good deeds, this generates merit, which will then benefit you whenever calamity strikes. And as we outlined, good works and good deeds in this context are filial piety, respecting your elders, being a good son or a good husband or a good wife. But the system of Confucian relationships actually goes all the way up to the emperor. So you might have a son who needs to have a good relationship with the father needs to have a good relationship with the local elites need to have a good relationship with the high-level government officials, and then they have that obligation to the emperor. So in this way, even ordinary people do have this system of webs and relationships that connects them all the way to the emperor. So therefore, state functions like tax collection and donating to the militia and maybe even joining the militia in certain times are all wrapped up in this moralistic explanation of the war in terms of reward and punishment. People like Yu are promoting this, probably in part because they believe it's the right thing to do, but also because they're advocating for their own political and moral viewpoints. In this case, Yu was supporting the Qing dynasty by spreading this message. And there is a interesting implication here to this line of thinking, which is that according to people like Yu and those promoting this viewpoint of moralism and reward and punishment, the devastation and the chaos and death of the Taiping Civil War is not necessarily the fault of the state. It's the fault of ordinary people for not fulfilling their obligations to society. In one of his writings, acting through a character he created, Yu says, quote, "The repayment of benevolence isn't a precise accounting. You should take what you owe the emperor in taxes and pay it as early as possible. You should make sure that you live peacefully and don't commit crimes against the king's laws. Then it can be counted as not turning your back on imperial benevolence. If you don't pay your taxes, even if you burn incense to the Buddha every day, you will not accumulate merit. If you plant rice, then you must pay your rents. Your collected rents then become taxes, and then you can face the emperor." End quote. The idea here is that the reward and punishment stuff works both ways. And according to narratives like this, perhaps the suffering that's coming about as a result of the Taiping Civil War is a punishment for people who aren't doing their duty to society and aren't accumulating enough merit. Both reward and punishment can be incredibly valuable as motivating and psychological tools. But the problem, of course, is that obviously this divine retribution and punishment stuff isn't going to be believable for very long, simply based on the scale and the scope of the devastation that the Taiping Civil War brought about. People may figure out quickly that no matter how many good things they do, or no matter how many merit points they achieve, the Taiping army raiding and looting through the area doesn't really care. The roving mass of bandits looking to feed themselves on your food stocks doesn't care how much you respected the emperor during this cycle. And even the virtuous wouldn't be exempt from the killings and the rapes and the death. So as the deaths of even the so-called good people in the eyes of Yu began to pile up, Yu's thinking shifted to focus more on divine rewards rather than divine punishments. Now, as you engage in filial piety and other good deeds from a Confucian perspective, you're not necessarily avoiding punishment, but you are gaining potentially divine reward. You're paying back old ancestors who laid the path for you. You're basically giving karma to your future generations who haven't been born yet by your good deeds now. And you're also preventing future calamities and disasters and wars. As an example, historian Tobie Meyer-Fong points to Yuji wanting people to donate to his cause of helping refugees across a particular area of China. And he's saying that by giving money now, you're going to be preventing future disasters that nobody can predict, saying, quote, "The coming of catastrophe cannot be anticipated. Whether it arrives sooner or later has not yet been decided. Moreover, the next catastrophe will not necessarily be soldiers and swords. Flood, fire, rebels, bandits, plagues, disease, famine, starvation. Which of these is not a catastrophe? In a split second, locusts can arrive, rendering fame and profit into nothingness. Of the millions of a family fortune, a single coin may not survive. The swords and soldiers may not come, but heaven-sent disaster will surely come someday. In order to flee this disaster, where can you go? To avoid this catastrophe, what skill can you employ?" End quote. Yuji there with a great example of pulling on the strings of the logic of divine reward and divine punishment in order to elicit donations and further his own particular cause and his own particular version of who gets to decide what remains and what is remembered about the way people thought about a conflict. People like Yuji often, again, spoke on lecture circuits or created pamphlets or essays through the written word. And oftentimes what they wrote about and what they drew about was exaggerated, but it was real. So they might have put pictures of dogs eating babies or cannibalism or excessive and grotesque violence, which, of course, probably surely happened during the Taiping Civil War, but these were not exact recreations of specific events, but they were real pragmatically and metaphorically. These pamphlets were written in vernacular and had a propagandistic appeal, short, sweet, emotional, and again, tugging on the strings of reward and punishment. An example of this is in Tobie Meyer-Fong's book, where Yuji has a picture of a Taiping attack on a village. Heads are being chopped off, body parts are lying all over the place, scenes of rape and pillaging. And the text underneath this says, quote, "Wherever the rebels went, they cruelly and mercilessly plundered and pillaged. Their behavior was like that of wild dogs. They did not distinguish between famous households, old lineages, and the rest. Wherever they went, they dealt harshly. People died or were captured. These are all unspeakable things. A family fortune of 10,000 strings of cash suddenly turned to nothing. A beauty so lovely that she could cause city walls to tumble is herself half ruined. Scratch your head and ask heaven. So strange that it seems halfway between belief and doubt. The only explanation can be reward and retribution." End quote. Good propaganda, as many have pointed out before, is often short, sweet, to the point, and meant to shock people into action. And again, it's all outlined in moral terms. Oftentimes, there was also an appeal to a mythic past, which was good. And now, because of a declining culture and moral transgressions from ordinary people in society, that societal decline is leading to disaster. This is certainly a narrative we've seen in other places and other troubled times of history. But at any rate, the ultimate conclusion of the narrative is one of restoration and reconciliation. If enough people accumulate enough merit and behave well enough, then order can and will be restored. Historian Tobie Meyer-Fong describes one of these illustrations by Yuji at the conclusion of one of his pamphlets, talking about this narrative of restoration that comes at the end. Quote, "A child leads a man with a cane to join the crowd of readers and listeners. He seems to gesture, 'Come along, the tidings are good.' The emperor is present, again in our community. A woman and child stand in the doorway under a damaged roof, listening to the good news. The people have returned to their proper places. The captives have returned, the women and children are back in their assigned domestic space." The remaining images in the book aver that order has been restored. They celebrate the completion of a process that in reality had barely begun at the time of publication. The images and text foreground the imperatives of reintegration, reconstruction, and restoration, creating a happy ending in text, even as continued disorder and devastation on the ground rendered such optimism premature. The author celebrates the achievements of the provincial leadership. They have restored communities through benevolence and compassion and guided local elites to build bureaus and exercise their influence. This praise song for the provincial government emphasizes the role to be played by activist elites such as Yuji himself in the reconstruction, even as it seeks to inspire donations to underwrite recovery in a time of severely constrained government funds. As a result of this official local collaboration presided over by a benevolent symbolic center, quote, "All of the people live together. They work to form a peaceful collective that embodies imperial kindness." End quote. Back to Tobie Meyer-Fong here. The emperor appears here as a beneficent symbol of virtue, a value to be embodied by the populace, and an entity in whose name activist elites could govern according to their own interests. End quote. Again, this all fits in to the narrative of reward and punishment and the idea that rewards are motivating and giving people a look into a future where order is restored can be a motivating force even as death and chaos are surrounding them completely in the moment. But Tobie Meyer-Fong brings up some interesting things in that quote, one of which is simply asking the question of who is benefiting from all of this. As we pointed out before, this narrative of reward and punishment seems to benefit the state in some ways, in part because it takes the focus and the blame off of them, and in some ways shifts it back onto the ordinary people who have to deal with these calamities that they created by not doing enough good things. It makes you wonder about characters like Yuji, who are local elite type of figures who see an opportunity to reshape society in a way that they want it to go. And at a time of mass chaos and upheaval, it is an opportunity for these types of people to stake a claim on what is going to be remembered about this war, how people are going to think about it, and how it's going to be interpreted at the time, which may pass on historically over the decades and the centuries. Perhaps ironically, a message of reward and restoration and healthy government can spread further in times of war. So I think this process of people trying to make sense of the Taiping Civil War as it was happening is interesting. And you wonder, were people like Yuji a top-down effort to go toe-to-toe with Taiping religion? Or was this a mark of a more religious and moral time? Did people just have more religious conviction in this place at this time? And this brings us to another question, which is, does any of this actually tell us how ordinary people themselves thought, or merely how local elites like you wanted them to think? Potentially both, but either way, I do think that this narrative of reward and punishment, divine retribution and divine restoration, the ways in which these ideas percolated throughout society during the Taiping Civil War, and the ways that they were promoted by certain people in certain situations, tells us a little bit about human psychology and what it might have been like psychologically to live through the time. At the very least, the sheer number of people talking about this war at the time as some sort of divine punishment or heavenly catastrophe or unprecedented apocalypse gives us insight into just how crazy and devastating the Taiping Civil War actually was.